Well, if these old headstones could talk, they could tell us lots of interesting stories about our past. To visit them, all you need to do is enter through the squeaky old wrought iron gate. But don't let the squeaking scare you. It's fine. Just come on in. The handmade gate and the ornate old iron fence that surrounds the cemetery here at the Chapel of the Cross in Madison County serves to set the mood for the place. Now, some of these old headstones behind the chapel have even been here for a century and a half. Each of them are unique unto themselves, but there's one grave in particular that always seems to grab the most attention. It's that unusually large grave over there between the old magnolia tree and the back of the chapel. It's the grave of Henry Gray Vick. Henry Vick was the oldest son and heir to one of the largest plantations in Mississippi called Nidayuma. Henry was on his way back from Jackson when the wheel of his buggy broke, and he just happened to be crossing Annandale Plantation at the time and took his wheel to Ingleside, the mansion there, to be repaired. When he knocked on the door, he was greeted by a beautiful young woman. Her name was Helen Johnstone, the daughter of the house. As it turned out, she was the belle of Mississippi and the most desirable, unattached woman in the state. Well, it was love at first sight. Henry visited with her for a while, and their friendship began to blossom. All too soon, his wheel was repaired, and he was on his way back to Vickland, his home at Nidayuma Plantation. Despite the distance, all his thoughts from that day forward were of returning to Helen. The courtship spanned several years, as was the custom in those days, until Henry asked for her hand in marriage, and she accepted. The wedding was set for May 21st, 1859. Now, that was also the date of Helen's 21st birthday. Surely it would be a very special day for all to remember. The bachelor party was held the weekend before the wedding at Vickland, Henry's home along the banks of Deer Creek on the Nidayuma Plantation. All of his closest friends were there, including his best friend, James Stith. It was after all the participants had left, with the exception of James Stith, that a disagreement between James Stith and Henry would occur that would tragically change the lives of everyone involved. You see, back in those days, honor wasn't an important thing. It was the only thing. Old Jake had been Henry's slave all of the young Mr. Vick's life. And old Jake had raised Henry from a young boy and taught him how to hunt, fish, and shoot so well that Henry was considered the best shot in the state. The relationship between old Jake and Henry was so strong, in fact, that old Jake was seen to be more like a father to Henry rather than a slave. It was often said that people would sometimes puzzle as to whether Henry Vick owned old Jake, or did old Jake actually own Henry Vick. James Stith ordered old Jake to bring him his horse, as the clouds outside Nidayuma had grown dark as an intense thunderstorm was forming on the horizon. And James Stith, not wanting to get caught in the storm, was hurriedly packing his saddlebags. Stith had planned to jump on his horse and ride as fast as he could the short distance to catch the steamboat at the Nidayuma landing without getting wet. As soon as old Jake had brought Stith's horse to the hitching rail outside the house, he abruptly ordered old Jake to go fetch his saddlebags. So old Jake did what he was told, but in his haste, he didn't have time to tell Mr. Stith that the horse had not been cinched. And while old Jake was inside, Stith attempted to mount the horse. As a result, both he and the saddle fell to the ground in a cloud of dust. At that moment, old Jake came running out of the house with the saddlebags and realized what had just happened. But by this time, James Stith was furious. As he dusted himself off, he cursed at old Jake and threatened to beat him.
"Ought to have you beat!"
James Stith then stomped back into the house, threw open Henry's door, and demanded that Henry beat old Jake. Henry said all that was hurt was James' pride, and he wasn't about to beat old Jake. James Stith became even more infuriated and took great offense toward Henry. He claimed that Henry was holding the honor of a slave over his. At that point, James Stith coldly stared at Henry and with a loud voice told Henry that if he ever saw him again, there would be trouble. Well, the next day, Henry rode over to Annandale to meet with Helen. He was picking up the final list of items they needed for the wedding, and then would go from there to New Orleans to pick them up. Once he arrived in Annandale, he told her about the incident at the bachelor party. And Helen made him promise never to kill a man. Despite his strong feelings about the matter, Henry gave his word of honor that he would obey her request. And with the list in hand, Henry rode over to Vicksburg, where he joined his friends as they took the boat to New Orleans. Once they arrived in New Orleans, Henry quickly acquired all the items he needed, and as they'd be waiting a few hours before the boat was finished loading, they decided to relax and play a game or two of billiards at a nearby tavern. As Henry was chalking his cue, a shadow of a figure filled the doorway. It was James Steiff. Henry's friends, not aware of what had occurred between the two of them, called Steiff over for a drink. The voice came from the darkness and said, "I will not drink with a man who has no honor." As Henry was about to speak, James Steiff quickly moved toward Henry and slapped his gloves across Henry's face. It was a direct affront to Henry's honor, and Steiff followed the insult by challenging Henry to a duel. And of course, Henry, being a man of honor, could not refuse. In 1859, dueling had been outlawed in New Orleans, so it was decided they would duel at the racetrack in Mobile, Alabama. Early the next morning, the two of them arrived at the fairgrounds. The weapons chosen were Kentucky long rifles at a distance of 30 feet. On the count of 3, they would fire. So on the count of 1, Henry pointed his rifle into the air and fired. Henry had hoped that Steiff would understand that he meant him no harm, but Steiff didn't. He took aim and fired. The bullet ricocheted off Henry's rifle barrel and hit Henry in the temple, killing him instantly. The seconds brought Henry's body back to Nidda-Yuma. Henry's father, Colonel Henry Vick, immediately sent old Jake to Annandale with a note for Margaret Johnstone. In it, he told of Henry's death and asked that Henry be buried at the Chapel of the Cross. So it was shortly before midnight on May 20th, 1859, as the church bell at the Chapel of the Cross began to ring, that Henry's body was lowered into his grave during a torchlit ceremony. For Helen, that was to have been the happiest day of her life, and yet it became the saddest. The bride-to-be, in turn, would spend the rest of her life wishing for what might have been.